Hello and welcome. It's time for part 3 of my Eternal Set review series. This time I'm gonna review the Justice faction. Let's dive right in. One quick note on the Seek of Power that's always showing up with filtered to one faction. This card might be slightly misunderstood by Magic players as a lay of the land. While the card is actually a bit better, it's basically like a slightly worse or slightly better, depending on how you look at it, Evolving Wilds. Since with the Mulligan in Eternal you're guaranteed 2 power sources or more, makes this basically a guaranteed power source, since you usually have at least 2 actual sigils or banners or whatever to cast this. And then it's basically a colorless land drop, colorless power drop that fetches one of the basic sigils for you, just like an Evolving Wilds, and costs 1 mana, basically just like an Evolving Wilds, because with Evolving Wilds the basic land you search comes to play tapped. Here the you have to pay 1 mana to get it, but you can do that early on when you don't need the mana, just like with Evolving Wilds. And it's actually a spell which might have potential upsides, can have downsides because it can also be countered by Backlash, but that's the only relevant interaction. All in all, the card is better than it seems in this game and should not be underrated. It's basically a diplomatic seal for slower decks that care about their influence in high amounts. Alright, let's move on to Justice. First we have the Emerald Monument, the Monument for Justice. This is one of the weaker monuments. I would say it is still better than the Fire Monument, but not great. But at least +3/+3 on your best unit usually will make the unit usually outclass most of or everything of what your opponent is doing. So that's a decent addition to the board. But in order for it to even be relevant, you need a unit. So if you're running low on resources and need a threat, all you get is a weapon rather than an actual threat, which can be problematic. And that's usually what the monuments are for. They're like your last threat when you're running low on threats, on pressure against control decks or other grindy decks, for example. So bit of a so-so card here. You won't see it played that much. Next we have Detain. Not a particularly good card for any format. In Constructed this is basically unplayable, and in Limited it's also fairly bad. It can be like a bad filler if you really need that one last card, because it at least can pseudo kill a creature in combat if you block and then shrink theirs and yours kills theirs, but theirs can't kill yours. It's like a really bad situational removal type effect, and it's only until end of turn, so not a good card. Next we have District Infantry. This card is a bit better than it would be in Magic, because the Empower is a bit easier to enable than Landfall in Magic, just because there's more cards that actually give you additional power drops in this game than there's playable cards that give you extra lands in Magic. But the card is still not too great. If you're very aggressive, might be fine. In Constructed it usually doesn't see much play, because if you're playing an aggressive Justice deck, you usually focus more on weapons and Warcry, so this guy is worse than the other 1-drop options usually. And in Limited he can be decent in a Justice based aggressive deck, but he's nothing to be excited about. He will often just not make the deck either way, even in Limited. Next we have Elder's Feather. This card's pretty decent. Flying is good evasion, especially for that cheap. Also adds 1 attack, so adds pressure. Especially good with Warcry units, makes your Warcry trigger safely and deal damage. Overall a pretty good card, and even a decent card in Constructed in Rakano aggro decks, in my opinion, and a pretty solid pickup in Limited in general. Next we have Finest Hour, just your everyday giant growth. We have Lightning Bolt here. Also, why wouldn't we have giant growth as well? Card is not bad. It's basically giant growth. I think giant growth is a bit better in this game than in Magic, just because of the stack being less complex and the game focusing even more on units than Magic probably. So pretty solid limited card, and even fine in constructed as a combat trick for like hyper aggressive justice based aggro decks. I think I've seen this played in constructed against me multiple times, and it does some solid stuff. Counters some removal, wins combat, and deals the last damage. Just what you would expect from giant growth. And there's less blowout potential in this game, I would say, than there's in Magic. There's less unconditional removal, especially less fast spell unconditional removal that can punish you for using this. Next we have Inspire. This is a pretty typical cantrip basically. 1 power for drawing 1 card, and in addition you get a minor effect, which is nice. Makes your deck thinner and increases the impact of the next unit or weapon you draw. Very solid card, solid filler and limited. Nice cantrip for your constructed deck if you're looking to increase the impact of the few weapons and units you're playing, and want to virtually reduce the size of your deck by 4. Next we have Protect. This basically gives you a one-time hexproof type of shield. Worth noting is that Aegis also prevents global effects like Wrath of God type effects. There is a 5 mana sweeper, for example, that kills all units, and Aegis makes your unit survive that. So that's relevant to know. And yeah, this basically is a 1 mana hard counter to all kinds of removal and effects your opponent can cast. And yeah, it's just pretty versatile card, and a lot better than giving hexproof until end of turn is in Magic, for example, especially because the shield sticks around until it is popped once. It's a pretty nice and flexible card for limited and for constructed. You will see this card a lot, and make sure to play around it because it can really blow you out big time. Next we have Steadfast Deputy. Not particularly exciting, but the fact that he has Aegis makes him a decent weapon carrier, but the fact that he's only a 1/1 makes him a pretty weak weapon carrier, and there's usually better options in limited and constructed. And if you have no ways to enhance him, he's basically just a dead card, so not a great card in either format. Next we have Tinker Apprentice. This is a decent 1-drop for an aggressive deck. It's indirectly a 1 mana 2/2. It's a 1 mana 1/1 when you play it, and gives usually your next best play in your hand +1/+1, either increasing the effect of a weapon or relic weapon, or making your 2-drop or other 1-drop that you're gonna play with a second 1-drop on turn 2 bigger, which is pretty nice. Like, imagine a curve of turn 1 Oni Ronin, turn 2 this guy, pump another 1-drop, play the pumped 1-drop, for example. That's a pretty powerful curve there, and then you have the chance to follow it up with Elder's Feather and stuff. This is a pretty solid card, either for a hyper aggressive 1-drop heavy justice based aggro deck and constructed, or just a solid enhancer and limited. Next we have Valkyrie, Aspirant. Pretty decent limited card, I think, if your deck is more aggressive and has a bunch of weapons, since it also scales decently into the late game thanks to its ultimate. And in constructed this is not very relevant unless you're running some weird Justice Primal flyer aggro deck. Then it's a solid card, but other than that, not a constructed card. Argentport Soldier, average vanilla 2-drop, nothing to be excited about, not a constructed card, but an okay limited 2-drop if you need a 2-drop. Next we have Crownwater Longsword, a very solid 2-mana weapon, great enhancement for your 1-drop, and just in general a pretty solid weapon. Alright, next we have Crownwater Paladin. Justice is premium 2-drop. 2/2 Warcry Aegis is really good. This makes it your premier weapon target, and also enhances your weapons and units on top of your deck. In addition, just a great card and really annoying to deal with because of the Aegis. Obviously, premium limited card as well. Next we have Minotaur Grunt, not a constructed card, but actually a pretty decent limited 2-drop thanks to the 3 toughness and Warcry. Makes it easy to attack for Warcry, even though often without dealing damage to the opponent, but triggering Warcry is pretty good there. And it also blocks fairly well in the early game. Next we have Paladin Ozbook. This is somewhat of an interesting card. I think in limited this is very good, because you can usually hold back your units to play defense and attack with your best unit or with your evasive unit to make it grow more and more each turn and grow out of hand and force your opponent to either have like a hard removal or just lose to it. And there's not that much use for it in constructed, because you usually either play a lot of units and are aggressive and then you want to attack with multiple units, or you are more of a mid-range or control deck where you either have very few creatures and don't care about the effect, or don't care about the effect because the creatures you have already are really big and you rather have more creatures than a Paladin Ozbook. There's some random cheap Justice Aggro type deck that plays that card in constructed, but that's like a budget deck basically, not a legitimately competitive deck. Next we have Rebuke. This is a bit better than the silence effects we saw in Time, but still not great. In constructed you will never play this, and even in limited I try to avoid it, but at least it can buy you some time and or silence a high impact card from your opponent, but all in all a bad filler. Next we have Reinforce. Justice is life gain, 2 mana gain 4, which is decent. It has to be noted that gain 4 armor is better than gain 4 life because of the interaction with weapons, so this is maybe a decent life gain sideboard option for like a control-ish deck that runs weapons, but nothing great. Next we have Roland's Favor, the Sigil Tutor of Justice. Again, nice synergy with what the faction is doing. Gives you 2 armor for your weapon or other armor relevant effects, which is nice. It also shows you that the color is not that aggressive, given that it has a bunch of more like defensive and utility based effects like gain 2 armor, which is a better version of gain 2 life basically. Next we have Tinker Overseer, a pretty solid 2-drop, actually a really good limited 2-drop. Not the greatest constructed card, because usually if you're playing Justice in constructed you're doing different things, where 2/2 flying that might turn into a 3/3 or 4/4 over the course of the game is not what you're looking for, but in limited, great 2-drop. Next we have Vanquish, a really good constructed and limited card, a very efficient and versatile removal for all the big problematic creatures. Doesn't care which faction, multi-faction, just kills them as long as they're big, which is pretty good. It's a bit of a downside that it's a spell, not a fast spell, but you can't have everything. Great limited card as well, obviously because it deals with bombs, and the only removal Justice has in constructed, and better than some removal that complementary colors that you might pair with Justice has too. Next we have Oryx Entry, pretty good limited card. High toughness makes it a good blocker together with endurance, and the high toughness and endurance also mean that it can usually attack in the first couple turns to trigger Warcry without dying and still being able to block. In Constructed, this is usually not a particularly relevant card. I can see this being an okay sideboard card against aggressive decks, maybe, because it's a good blocker and also builds up Warcry at the same time. Once again, only saw this so far in the Mono Justice aggro deck, which is not a particularly competitive deck. Next we have Brightmaze Paladin, clearly not a constructed card, even though it has some synergies with weapons and can grow out of hand thanks to Lifesteal. It's just too weak for its cost. But in Limited it's a pretty solid 3-drop that can easily get turned on to be for attack or more for Lifesteal, either through Warcry or through weapons and stuff like that. It's a fine 3-drop, nothing to be excited about, but a solid card to put in your deck if you need 3-drops. Next we have Emerald Echolight, basically 3 power 2/1 that gains you 3 life, but it gains you 3 armor instead of 3 life, which is better, but once again nothing to be excited about. A fine sideboard option potentially in Constructed against burn heavy decks like Stonescar Burn, but other than that, not a card I would like to put in my Constructed main deck or even in most of my Limited decks, unless my deck is like pretty slow and defensive and has a lot of ways to take advantage of the 3 ammo with good weapons. Next we have Hero of the People. Hero of the People is actually a pretty interesting card. The problem is, usually when you play it, it is a 1/1 for 3, so very vulnerable, dies to Vara's favor and stuff like that. But once you play more units with battle skills, with abilities like flying and Warcry and stuff, Hero of the People grows into a monster, gets their abilities, gets +1/+1 for each battle skill that it gains. So in Limited, this can win you the game if it survives. In Constructed, you probably shouldn't put this into your deck. But I think in Limited, if you have enough cards to synergize with it, this can turn into a game-breaking bomb quickly if the opponent doesn't shut it down early. Next we have Huro Envoy. When a spell is played directly on Huro Envoy, you draw a card. It's not that great. Guy is a 3-mana 2/2, costs double Justice Influence, which is not that little for a 3-drop, and there's not even that many spells that you want to target it with, and the opponent might not even care about killing it with removal because it's just a 2/2, and even if they do, well, it replaces itself, but yeah. Not a good card in Limited or Constructed. I usually don't want this in any of my decks. Next we have Loyal Watchwing, clearly not a constructed card, but in Limited this can be a decent weapon carrier and Warcry enabler, but more of a filler usually because 1/1 for 3 is not what you're looking for in your 3-drops. Next we have Mark of Shame, a pretty poor pseudo removal injustice, clearly not a constructed card, but can be an okay removal option, pseudo removal option in Limited if you are looking for that and are more of a controlling defensive slow deck. Next we have Order of the Spire. Once again, probably not a constructed card because kind of fragile, and sure you can play it on turn 4 and then play a power card after to make it a 2/2, but then still you're playing a 2/2 on turn 4, and it's very vulnerable and takes too long for it to grow. But it can grow out of hand, which makes it a nice Limited card. In Limited you can play it on turn 3, hope it survives, pump it on turn 4, play a Sigil, then it's suddenly a monster. Like, it's enough to put like a 2/2 weapon on it and then play a power card, then suddenly you have a 6/6 that can attack on turn 4. So a pretty good Limited card all in all if you can enable it, even though it takes a bit time to set up. Next we have Privilege of Rank. This card is usually not good enough for either format, I think. Sure, it gets you a 2-for-1, but it's only sigils that you're getting, and the fact that this is going to be discarded so you get value out of it barely ever happens, basically, since there's not much discard. And yeah, and by the time that might happen, you might have already cast it because you needed the sigils. A pretty bad card in both formats. Next we have Silverwing Familiar, a pretty great weapon carrier once again. Lifesteal and Aegis and Flying are all three effects that make it a great weapon carrier. Just play this on 3, slap your best weapons on it from turn 4 onward, and just keep bashing your opponent's face thanks to Lifesteal. You can keep attacking without risking to lose on the backswing usually. Pretty annoying card, and the Aegis makes it really hard to be dealt with. But on its own, it's obviously very weak, so you need enough ways to enhance it for it to be good. But it can win you the game easily. And it's even sometimes played and constructed just because it's an evasive lifesteal Aegis weapon carrier, basically. Next we have Treasury Guard, clearly another card that's for limited, not for constructed. But in limited I can see this being decent, especially the endurance synergizes well again with weapons. So it's a decent 3-drop for a weapon heavy deck, but not great. Next we have Valkyrie and Fosser. This is, I think, the best green 3-drop in limited and constructed. Just an overall great card. Potential first pick in limited, and a really great 3-drop for all kinds of justice decks in constructed, be it aggressive, mid-range or control. Silence and a 3/3 evasive body are always welcome. Next we have another Stranger. This time we have a 3-power 2/2 that gives all strangers Warcry. This is fairly weak, I think, because a 2/2 for 3 is pretty weak in terms of stats, and the Warcry is not that great. Sure, it gets enhanced because it's a Stranger and all, but being a 2/2 even as a Stranger is not too exciting. And the Warcry by turn 3 is a bit slow and all. But yeah, if there ever is a Stranger deck, who knows, maybe he might make it in. Next we have Armor Smiths. Kind of nice in the sense that you can that it synergizes with other armor cards, like you can play Roland's Favor on turn 2 and then play this for free. So basically this is 2-mana 2/2 that gives you 2 armor and makes your Roland's Favor cost 0 mana basically, which is kind of nice. Also makes your weapons better, like you can play a weapon and then play this guy to enhance your weapon the same turn and stuff like that. All in all, a pretty neat card for limited and constructed for more defensive decks that have weapon synergies like Armory and stuff. Next we have Bronze Cuirass. 4 power for +0/+4 is a lot. It replaces itself by drawing a card, but all in all I'd rather spend my 4 power on something more profitable and higher impact. Even if it replaces itself, doesn't matter that much if the effect that I'm gaining for the investment of time is just not worth it. Maybe I'm underrating the card, but to me this card seems too slow and low impact for the cost, even if it replaces itself. And definitely not a constructed card for sure. Next we have Copperhall Blessing. 4 power is very expensive for this effect, and yeah, there has to be a lot of blocking going on for this to matter. Otherwise, Aegis giving stuff would just be cheaper and better than this. All in all, not a great card. Definitely not a constructed card, and even in limited, I would not be excited to have this in my deck. Next we have Copperhall Recruit. No constructed card at all, and even in limited, not particularly good, but at least an okay defensive 4-drop. If you're just looking into like drawing out the game and playing a defensive, more controlling game, this might be the only option you have, and then it's a fine filler as a 4-drop. Next we have Crownwater Cavalry. This is basically a 4-power 4/4 that makes your best unit in play bigger instead of being a 4/4, and therefore like half of its stats basically have charge. So it's a nice limited card, I think, but in constructed this is too weak, too underpowered, too situational. Won't make it in your constructed deck. But I think in limited it's a pretty solid card probably. Next we have Hammer of Might. 4 power, 4+3/+3 is solid. Warcry 3, the turn you play it, is pretty nice because if you have a high density of weapons and units, you have a pretty high chance of drawing the Warcry card the turn after and having a huge impact, basically getting like a Hammer of Might on turn 4 and a free Hammer of Might on turn 5 as well, which is not too bad. Makes this a pretty good limited card, but not that good of a constructed card in my opinion, because 4 power for 4+3/+3 and an effect that you might get next turn or might not get next turn is a bit too unreliable and underwhelming in constructed. For my opinion, there's just better cards like Plating and stuff. Next we have Mantle of Justice, basically the Justice Influence affinity card. A pretty good limited card if you're heavy Justice. In constructed, this usually doesn't do anything outside of a budget mono Justice deck. Next we have Silverwing Avenger, another card that's usually not gonna show up in constructed, but is pretty good in limited. A 2/2 evader that also permanently shrinks one of your opponent's creatures is stellar. This is just a premium Justice 4-drop in my opinion. Next we have Stalwart Shield. +1/+3 and Endurance, in my opinion, is better than +0/+4 and draw a card. So this should usually get a nod over Bronze Cuirass in my opinion, just because of how nice Endurance can be. It can shut down exhaustion and stunning, kill a permafrost for example, or prematurely unstun a unit that has been stunned and stuff like that. And also adding 1 power over the force toughness is pretty good too. Not a constructed card, also not the greatest limited card in my opinion, but a fine filler. Next we have Hulu Fletchling, clearly not a constructed card either, but a decent evasive 5-drop for limited. I'm usually fine with having 1 or even 2 of these in my limited deck when I'm Justice. I think it's a pretty decent card. Next we have Mithril Mace, premium common of Justice in my opinion. A 3/4 weapon that you can enhance with additional armor effects, as we saw, is pretty nice for limited. Usually this is not constructed material stuff, but pretty good limited pickup. Can often kill 2 units if you can protect it. All in all, really great. Next we have Silverwing Commander. Again, usually not good enough for constructed because decks are more focused than just wanting good units in a vacuum. 4/4 flying Warcry 2 is pretty good stats for 5 power, but in constructed you're usually looking for more special stuff. But in limited, this is definitely a premium pickup. Early pick in Justice, great card. Next we have Ceremonial Mask. This card I have a bit of a mixed feeling about it. 6 power is a lot, +4/+4 is decent, and it's kind of a bit like Hammer of Might in a different way. You get the second conditional use of the card right away on either the same unit or another unit, but it's only a temporary +4/+4. But yeah, in limited this should have the potential to break open a stall and turn the game around. In constructed, this won't make it in your deck. I just noticed that I forgot to filter for cards I don't own, so I'll do that real quick and go over the cards that I don't own a copy of and have missed so far. Alright. Turn out the premium. Alright, is there anything I missed? Yeah. Eager Owlet. Pretty good 2-drop if you have enough flyers to turn it on, in limited especially, but even in constructed. If your deck is like some Justice, Primal, Flyer, Aggro deck, this is a premium 2-drop. But it's a bit situational, but in limited you should usually be able, depending on what color combination you're in, to make this a great 2-drop. Gilda Clave is actually a decent weapon, I would say. It's once again not a constructed card, but 3 power for +2/+2 is decent, given the fact that it will often be +4/+4 for the first couple of turns of the game. Makes this a pretty nice turn 3 weapon play on your 2-drop, for example, to pressure your opponent and start racing. The other card that I missed is Spire Tripling. Nothing too exciting here. Definitely not a constructed card in my opinion. 3 power, 3/2. In limited is on the low end of stats for its cost, but the fact that it replaces itself on the first attack and draws cards after that makes it a potentially better Amber Echolight in Justice in limited. So all in all, it is a decent 3-drop in limited. I would usually put it in my deck, but I wouldn't pick it too highly. Another staple that I missed is Oryx Rune Hammer. This card is great in both constructed and limited. In limited it's kind of a bomb, and even in constructed it's really good because you get to kill 1 unit for free even without taking damage, and after that you get to kill a second one if you can protect the weapon, which is not that easy usually, because even a Varus Favor kills the Rune Hammer. But still, the card is just great. Next we have Treasury Gate, the heart of the Armory deck basically. In limited, you usually won't have enough relic weapons and setup to make this card good enough, but in constructed this is definitely the build around type card that makes Armory a deck. You just play a bunch of removal and weapons and play like a mid-range control type, grind type game, making this and your weapons take over the game quickly and heavily after turn 4. Next we have Cambria Magister, not a constructed card, and even in limited this card is kind of so-so. 2 healths makes it pretty vulnerable to a lot of stuff that can kill it, and for 5 that can cause huge tempo swings. But the card can be somewhat annoying for your opponent if you can fuel it for a couple turns and you can just keep attacking if they have no unit that has 4 or more health. But all in all, I usually don't want this in my limited deck. Once again, a potential filler if you need that 45th card maybe. There's the Wrath of God effect that I talked about. Just your typical 5 power kill all units. Basically the same as we have in Magic these days, because sweepers usually cost 5 by now, if they are hard sweepers, and the same principle is applied here. Once again, keep in mind, Aegis prevents this, so if the opponent has units with Aegis, they survive. Next card is Marshal Ironthorn. A pretty good Justice bomb. This is just a bomb in limited, because you can just sit back, stall the board with the 5/5 body until you hit the 15 power, press the delete button, and win the game basically. If your opponent does not have one of the fewer hard removal for this guy. Really great. And even in constructed, this is a staple in Cambria midrange, for example. Just overall a really powerful card. Next we have kind of like a bad Might of Oaks. 6 power is a lot. 3 Justice Influence as well. And in addition, we get +6/+6, and unlike Might of Oaks, this effect is permanent. So it's at least a nice surprise. Not a constructed card, but in limited, this is a pretty solid pickup. It's a bit costly, but can create a monster and blow out the opponent in combat, which is not to be underestimated. If you're not having too high of a curve, this can be a really nice card in a limited deck. Has the potential to be a bomb, I think. Next we have Civic Peacekeeper, another card that has very poor stats for its cost, and Empower on high casting cost cards is somewhat tricky because a lot of the time you will have ran out of power cards, but if you have enough ways to fuel cards like this with power, this can be pretty nice, because consistently stunning a unit each turn can be really powerful and can turn around a stalled game in limited quickly. Clearly in constructed this is not even a consideration. Next we have Forestry Elder, a really good limited 6-drop, great card, early pick I would say. Makes it really hard for your opponent to deal you damage in any way, because this locks up the air, deals 4 damage a turn, and even blocks most of the ground guys as well at 6 health. Just a really good limited card. Next we have Plated Demolisher. This is, I don't know, kind of a weird card. I think in constructed this is not a consideration at all, because the opponent can way too easily try and destroy your armor with a lot of decks, and this just dies. In limited, if you have some armor givers and stuff, this might be really good, because 8/8 endurance for 6 is pretty big if you can protect it and protect your armor and set up some armor. But yeah, it's a situational card, so don't pick it too highly and evaluate carefully before putting this into your deck. But it can be pretty broken if it works out. Next we have Mercury Wings. Once again, not a constructed card at 6. 6 power for +2/+4 weapon, but in limited this is once again a premium weapon, giving 4 health and aegis, and evasion is another win condition / stall breaker. Just slap it on your best guy and start killing the opponent while they helplessly look at it, needing to removal to even stop it from killing them. Pretty good limited card. Early pick. Next we have Flight Lieutenant. Again, 7 power, 4/4, not a constructed card, but the possibility to give all your units flying in a stall and alpha strike the opponent for the win is very, very threatening and limited. This is a pretty decent 7-drop for limited, as far as 7-drops go. 7-drops are pretty slow and expensive, but this one at least has the potential to win a stalled game. So depending on your deck, this could be a solid curve topper for your deck. Same here, 7 power, 6/6 flying lifesteal is pretty good stats for a 7-drop, so if your deck is looking for 7-drops, this is a card that is definitely worth looking at and putting into your limited deck if your deck is slow enough. But keep in mind, your deck actually needs to be able to not already be losing by the time you hit 7. Last but not least, actually second to last, we have Roland the Iron Fist. He's a 6/6 endurance that gives all your justice units endurance and invulnerable. This usually is not particularly appealing for constructed, especially where people have removal and just kill it and blow you out in combat when you try to attack and stuff. But in limited, as most 8-drops in this game, it's a pretty powerful effect. You can play it on turn 8 and then just attack with everything while they are invulnerable if your opponent has no hand cards or not enough mana to kill it, or is in colors that can't kill it instant speed or can't kill it at all. So once again, another potential game breaker for a slow deck that can survive and hit 8 power to cast this. And last but not least, we have Sword of the Sky King. Once again, 8 power is expensive, but this is a pretty good card in weapon-based, justice-based control in mid-range decks and constructed, like Ikaria Blue or Armory, for example, as a one-off to tutor for example. Makes this usually a 10-8 weapon, which is really nice, and if your opponent has no units, this can also be a great win condition against other control decks, for example. If they have like one unit, bash down the unit, and after that hit your opponent for 10 in the face. And in limited, this can easily eat 2 or 3 units and turn around an even game, if your deck is slow enough to take advantage of it. So a pretty good card for both formats. Alright, that's it with the Justice review. Let me know what you think in the comments. If you disagree with my evaluations of the cards and why, and also if you have any questions regarding the evaluations, if you didn't understand my reasoning for certain assessments, for example, feel free to ask. If you enjoyed my review, feel free to like, subscribe and follow me on social media for future content. Would be really nice. I'm currently trying to establish myself as eternal content creator with my long time experience as a Magic player, and every like, every subscription, every follow helps increase my reach and reach more people and grow as a content producer. Alright, thanks for watching. See you next time with the Primal review. Bye.